So what's the context? Let's see, it's 1898. The long depression that straddled the 1880s is over, but it's still a relatively recent memory. The colonial economy is on the up. The railway department was expected to play a role in the expanding economy, but they were facing a locomotive crisis. They had a limited number of quote-unquote modern tender locomotives. In fact, truly modern, they had all of 4 produced over the last 5 years or so at Addington that I discussed in the last episode. They had older types that are still modern enough, dating from the mid-1880s, specifically 16 examples of the Waru wheel arrangement, 10 from Naismith Wilson and 6 from Baldwin, and 16 of the alluvial fan plane wheel arrangement. Again, 10 from Naismith Wilson and 6 from Baldwin. Those 6 from Baldwin were the N class, which at that point, 1898, remained the best locomotives the colony had ever had. So that's the context. Why shop American? Let's see. Okay, first thing, Baldwin produced the N class, which remained the best locomotive type in the colony. Secondly, Baldwin could produce 10 locomotives, which would represent a more than 1/4 expansion of the modern tender locomotive fleet very, very quickly. Thirdly, they could do it for half the price of building one in Addington, and Addington at their rate of construction would need the best part of a decade to build 10 locomotives. They also had a reputation for prompt delivery and achieving weight margins, which was important on the shoestring railway and which Naismith Wilson failed rather miserably at when they attempted to supply their V-class locomotives a decade and a half earlier. Did Baldwin deliver? Yes, they did. You can see on the left the date of order. You can see on the right the date of shipping. The entire batch arrived together. They were assembled in quick order. They rolled into service in December of 1898. What were the differences between the Baldwins and the Addington T-cows? Let's see. Aesthetically, the Addington locomotives looked very, very British, particularly the first 2. The Baldwins looked classically North American, and they compare visually to the types that rolled out into American service during that decade. Technically, the Addingtons and the Baldwins both had slide valves. Looking back, it's easy to criticize the slide valve, but in 1898 there wasn't anything particularly wrong with them. They were a well understood piece of technology that had been in service for decades without too much of an issue. The Addington U's had Volschart's valve gear, whereas the Baldwins had Stephenson's link. Again, looking back 125 years to 1898 or so, easy to criticize the Stephenson, and fair enough perhaps in a narrow gauge configuration because the maintenance would have to be carried out between the frames of a narrow gauge locomotive rather than in the greater space between the frames of a standard gauge locomotive. A slide valve kind of looks like that. It's square in section, profile, plan, open at the bottom. The steam is admitted on the outside of the slide valve box in a normal sort of pressure situation that works adequately fine and had done for decades. When it comes to superheated steam or high pressured steam, what tended to happen was that the weight of that steam in the steam chest would push the slide valve against its running surface. It would create higher lubrication demands compared with a piston valve, and it would create more wear and tear in the steam chest and with the valve itself. So they didn't respond particularly well to superheated steam, but that's another story. They also, the Baldwins, had a higher pitched boiler. What that meant was that the firebox width was dictated by the inside width of the driving wheels rather than the inside width of the frame, which was the case with lower pitched boilers. Baldwin also produced a locomotive with significant heating surface when compared with, say, the 1899 Sharp Stewarts that will be featured in another episode. Were they any good? Yes, they were. They were, frankly, when they arrived into service, the best locomotives the colony had ever had, and they would hold that title, in my view, until the 1901 batch of Baldwins improved on them. They had a reputation, along with the 1901s, of running like an N and hauling like a B. That's relatively meaningless if you don't understand the alphabet soup of New Zealand locomotives, but for that period of time, it was high praise. And there's an episode that explains the development of locomotives up to the Baldwin-built T-cows. Did they have any mods and cons? Yes, Sean Miller's book details these rather nicely. They did get superheating in the 1920s, at least 7 of them did. By the 1930s, they had been scrapped, and I think that has to do with partly the maintenance problems and lubrication expenses and the maintenance tasks associated with the valve mechanism being between the frames and the downturn in traffic during the Depression, and the fact that their boilers, and this theme is repeated with the Sharp Stewarts, could be used as donor boilers to keep the 1901 Baldwins in service for longer. Did they last in first tier service? After 1901, if a locomotive foreman had a choice between a 1901 Baldwin and an 1898, they probably would go with the 1901s. They were even more popular with the crews than the 1898s. But it wasn't until the weight of numbers of the Passchendaele types in South Island service became such that they displaced the 1898s that they ended up in the second tier duties. Do they appear in any really interesting railway accidents that I would like to tell you about? Yes. And here's a link to an ongoing series of videos about that collision that deals with it in considerable depth. Thanks for asking. What do their road numbers look like on a graph? They look like a straight line from there to there. That's because Baldwin produced 10 locomotives very, very quickly, shipped them in one batch, and they were assembled in the space of a couple of weeks. Are there any left? There is a mention online of one of them being recovered from Oamaru, where they got turfed into the surf back in the 1930s. It ended up, according to the internet, at Waitara, which is, of course, a kiss of death for locomotives so recovered. I can't find any mention of its fate, but by way of spoiler, UB17, which hopefully I've done an episode on, was cut up for scrap by the New Plymouth District Council as a public hazard. Fairly ignoble way for a class of locomotives that answered the call in 1898 to go, but short of steaming out of service and into preservation, there's no good way for a locomotive to go. All right, yes, it's time for a musical montage. Thanks once again to the NZRLS archives for many of the photos. Like, subscribe, enjoy. Cheers.